That Christmas Eve, my family toasted my sister as if I were just the maid. My mother ignored me entirely until my sister smirked, calling my startup a temporary room app for storm victims. I set my fork down and announced I had just sold it for $170 million. Yet, that number did not destroy our family. It was the truth that followed. They had taken much more from me than just their attention. I am Ella Gray. I steered my battered, sand-filled SUV down the pristine, frost-covered streets of Briar Glen, the suburban enclave where I had spent my childhood, learning how to be invisible. It was barely 5 o'clock in the evening, but the winter darkness had already settled over the neighborhood. The houses here were large, imposing, and aggressively festive. Every lawn featured perfectly synchronized holiday displays. But as I pulled into my parents' driveway, I noticed the string of white lights hanging from the gutters of my childhood home was distinctly crooked. It sagged on the left side, a tiny imperfection in an otherwise flawless facade. That crooked wire was perhaps the most honest thing about the property. As soon as I killed the engine, the familiar, suffocating aroma of artificial cinnamon pine cones seeped through the frosty air the moment I opened the front door. It was a scent designed to project the illusion of a warm, decent, perfectly functional American family. I wiped my boots on the welcome mat, knowing exactly what I was walking into. This was supposed to be our traditional Christmas Eve dinner, but like everything else in this house, the holiday had been quietly hijacked and repurposed. Tonight was not about the birth of a savior or the spirit of giving. My parents had covertly transformed the evening into a grand celebration for Sloane Gray, my golden younger sister. Sloane had just secured a massive promotion at her corporate firm and was on the verge of getting engaged to her equally polished boyfriend, Graham Vale. Christmas was merely the backdrop. Sloane was the main event. I had barely hung my heavy wool coat on the rack before the unwritten rules of the house snapped into place, shoving me firmly into my designated role. There were no warm embraces, no eager inquiries about my drive. Instead, my mother, Denise, leaned out from the kitchen, a wine glass already in her hand, and pointed toward the oven. She did not say hello. She simply told me the roast needed basting and the potatoes were waiting to be mashed. Within 3 minutes of crossing the threshold, I was the early arrival tasked with kitchen duty, the designated food runner, the reliable background character who required zero emotional maintenance. I was the child nobody needed to worry about, which in my family's language translated directly to the child nobody needed to care about. I washed my hands, tied a faded apron over my dark sweater, and got to work. Through the swinging door of the kitchen, I could see the dining room. The table was set with my mother's best china, the plates gleaming under the chandelier. In the center of the table, flanked by tall silver candlesticks, sat a small, elegant bakery cake. Across its smooth white icing, elegant cursive letters read, "Congratulations, Sloane." Next to the cake stood a ridiculously expensive bottle of imported red wine, a gift Graham had brought to impress my father. I scanned the room, looking at the place settings, the decorations, the carefully curated environment. There was absolutely no sign that I, the eldest daughter, was a meaningful part of this family. I was the hired help who happened to share their last name. When the potatoes were finally mashed and transferred to a heated serving bowl, my mother glided into the kitchen to inspect my work. Denise Gray was a woman who treated maternal affection like a highly restricted currency, distributing it only when it yielded a direct return on investment. She stopped beside me, reached out, and absent-mindedly stroked my hair. The gesture was light, dismissive, the exact way one might pat a neighbor's dog. "Are you still doing that post-storm crisis management job?" she asked, her voice dripping with a casual, devastating pity. She said it as if I were handing out wet blankets at a roadside tent, as if my career were a temporary volunteer gig I had picked up to pass the time until I found real direction. She did not wait for an answer. She simply sighed, adjusted a loose strand of her own perfect hair, and murmured something about how I was always so willing to get my hands dirty. I bit the inside of my cheek and carried the heavy ceramic bowl into the dining room. My father, Martin Gray, was standing by the fireplace, a glass of scotch resting on the mantel. He was on a video call with his brother, my uncle, holding his phone at arm's length. His voice boomed through the room, full of that specific, hollow pride he reserved exclusively for public performances. "Oh, you know Sloane," my father bragged to the glowing screen, entirely ignoring my presence as I set the food on the table. "She is officially stepping into the executive class, vice president before she turns 30. Graham is doing remarkably well, too. We are just thrilled." There was a brief pause as my uncle presumably asked about me. My father's broad shoulders immediately slumped a fraction of an inch. His tone shifted from triumphant fanfare to mild, polite resignation. "Ella? Oh, Ella is fine. You know Ella. Stable, practical, no trouble at all. She is just keeping her head down." Stable, practical, no trouble. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. To them, I was not a person with ambitions or a trajectory. I was a static object. I was the sturdy wooden chair in the corner of the room, useful when needed, entirely ignorable otherwise. I pulled out my chair at the far end of the table, closest to the kitchen door so I could easily clear the plates later. I sat down in the warm, cinnamon-scented room, surrounded by people who shared my blood, but did not know the first thing about me. Beneath my calm exterior, my pulse hummed with a quiet, lethal energy. I was carrying the heaviest, most monumental secret of my entire life. Exactly 3 weeks ago, I had sat in a sleek, glass-walled conference room in the city and signed a towering stack of legal documents. I had officially closed the sale of my disaster logistics company. I had built it from nothing, typing code on a sticky kitchen counter, mapping out shelter routes while the rest of the world slept. I had transformed a fragmented, failing crisis response system into a streamlined, indispensable network. And 3 weeks ago, a massive civic technology conglomerate had purchased my life's work for $170 million. I had not told a single soul in my family. Not my mother, who thought I was a glorified volunteer. Not my father, who proudly announced I was nothing more than stable and practical. Not Sloane, who was currently upstairs adjusting her designer dress, convinced she was the undisputed sun of our solar system. I had not kept the secret out of malice, nor had I driven 2 hours through the freezing dark tonight to flaunt my newfound, incomprehensible wealth. Showing off would require seeking their validation, and I had stopped craving their approval a long time ago. I came tonight for a completely different reason. I sat at that table, folding my linen napkin, because for the very first time in my 34 years of existence, I wanted them to build their own stage. I wanted them to stack their assumptions, their condescension, and their blatant favoritism as high as they possibly could. I was going to let them set the scene, pour the expensive wine, and cut the congratulatory cake. And then, I was going to let them hear the deafening sound of shattering glass as they realized just how profoundly, spectacularly wrong they had been about me for my entire life. I watched my mother arrange the silverware around Sloane's celebratory cake, and my mind drifted away from the cinnamon-scented dining room, traveling back down the long, quiet corridor of my childhood. The dynamic playing out before my eyes was not a sudden development. It was the defining pattern of our family, a pattern established so early that I could not remember a time before it existed. I was the child who had unwittingly dug my own grave of neglect simply by being competent. When I was 11 years old, the chain on my bicycle snapped halfway down a steep hill. I did not call my father at his office. I did not cry on the side of the road. I dragged the heavy metal frame 3 miles back to our garage, found a greasy wrench in the bottom of a rusted toolbox, and spent 4 hours figuring out how to thread the links back together. When I walked into the kitchen that evening, my hands coated in black grease and my knuckles bleeding, my mother merely glanced up from her magazine, handed me a paper towel, and told me to wash up before dinner. There was no fuss, no praise for my ingenuity, and certainly no concern for my scraped skin. The verdict had been cast early on. Ella knows how to manage. Ella does not need rescuing. That self-sufficiency became the perfect, guilt-free excuse for my parents to look the other way. because I could teach myself algebra, because I researched and filled out my own summer job applications, because I quietly packed my own lunches. They convinced themselves that I preferred the isolation. In their minds, they were simply giving me space. In reality, they were conserving all their parental energy, every ounce of their emotional and financial capital, for the child they deemed worthy of cultivation. Sloane was entirely different. She was a delicate, demanding plant that required the perfect soil, the precise amount of sunlight, and constant, unwavering attention. My parents had a phrase they loved to use when discussing my sister with their friends. Sloane needs to be nurtured in the right way. That phrase was the golden key that unlocked every door for her. The right way meant private tutors when she struggled with geometry in the 10th grade. It meant a brand new car on her 16th birthday, because riding the school bus might cause her unnecessary stress before her extracurriculars. Every word of encouragement, every spare dollar, and every bright opportunity flowed down a steep, frictionless incline directly into my sister's lap. The disparity was never subtle, though they pretended it was. I remember the spring of my junior year of high school. I had spent 6 months building a localized flood warning system for the regional science fair. It was a crude but highly effective network of moisture sensors and radio transmitters. Born from watching our basement flood year after year, I won first place out of 200 entries. I came home carrying a heavy brass plaque, my heart beating with a rare, desperate hope that this time they would finally look at me with that shining, unreserved pride. When I walked through the front door, the house was silent. I found my parents in the living room. My father had a hammer in his hand. My mother was stepping back to admire a brand new, custom-framed photograph they had just hung dead center over the fireplace. It was an 8x10 portrait of Sloane in a sharp navy blazer, smiling brightly after participating in a regional debate tournament where she had placed fourth. My mother saw me standing in the hallway, my heavy brass plaque clutched to my chest, and she smiled. She told me to be careful not to scratch the hardwood floor with whatever I was holding. The plaque ended up in the bottom of my closet. The photo of Sloane in her debate dress remained on that wall for 7 years. The older we got, the wider the canyon grew. When it came time for university, I spent countless late nights hunting for financial aid. I managed to secure a 75% academic scholarship to a state university. To cover the remaining tuition and my living expenses, I took a job working 25 hours a week at a campus logistics center, unloading boxes and sorting inventory until 2 in the morning. During my sophomore year, I sat at this very dining table and showed my father my tuition bill. I did not ask him to pay the whole thing. I just asked if he could help with a shortfall of $800 for my textbooks and a mandatory lab fee. My father barely looked at the paper. He patted my hand, offered a tight, patronizing smile, and delivered the line that would echo in my head for the rest of my life. "You are strong, Ella," he said, his voice entirely devoid of actual empathy. "You are a survivor. You always figure things out. You will be fine." I swallowed the knot in my throat, folded the bill, and put it back in my pocket. 10 minutes later, Sloane bounced into the room, complaining about how overwhelming her pre-law coursework was becoming. Without a second thought, my father pulled his leather checkbook from his breast pocket and wrote her a check for $3,500 to cover an elite, intensive prep course for the law school admission test. He handed it to her with a beaming smile, telling her that an investment in her future was the best money he could ever spend. Even conversation was a rigged game. Whenever I made the mistake of trying to share a piece of my life, a tough shift at work, a project I was passionate about, a minor victory, it was only a matter of seconds before my mother would hijack the narrative. I would be halfway through explaining how I reorganized the dispatch system at the logistics center, and Denise would hold up a manicured finger to cut me off. "Hold that thought, Ella," she would say, her eyes darting toward the hallway. "Sloane, did the producer from the local morning broadcast call you back yet? We really need to get you a new blouse if you're going to be on television next week." My story would die right there on the table, instantly irrelevant. What I realized over those long, quiet years was that the deepest wound did not come from being hated. Hate, at the very least, requires passion. Hate requires a person to look directly at you and acknowledge your existence. What I experienced was far more insidious. I was treated like a piece of structural furniture. I was the load-bearing pillar in the background. I was always present, completely reliable, highly useful when a problem needed solving or a mess needed cleaning, but entirely invisible. Nobody admires the foundation of a house until it cracks. Nobody looks at the quiet daughter until she stops being convenient. Being pushed to the absolute margins of my own family did not make me crumble, and it did not turn me into a weeping victim. Instead, it cultivated a very specific, extremely dangerous type of anger inside me. It was not the loud, explosive rage of a teenager throwing plates against a wall. It was a cold, methodical, architectural anger. It was the anger of a person who learns early on that the world will not hand her anything. So she must build a fortress with her own two hands. I learned how to be perfectly silent. I learned how to observe, how to record every slight, how to work relentlessly in the dark, and most importantly, how to wait for the absolute perfect moment to strike. They thought my silence was submission. They mistook my absence from their dramatic family orbit as a lack of ambition. When I spent weekends locked in my cheap apartment, poring over disaster relief data and writing lines of code until the sun came up, my parents assumed I was just trying to look busy to compensate for not being as brilliant as Sloane. They had no idea that the very neglect they subjected me to was the crucible that forged my endurance. Those years of being ignored stripped away my need for external validation. I did not need a cheering section to build an empire. While they were busy polishing Sloane's participation trophies and financing her manufactured success, I was out in the real world, learning how to manipulate systems, solve catastrophic failures, and construct a business that would eventually change an entire industry. They starved me of their attention, but in doing so, they inadvertently fed a hunger inside me that drove me to the exact table where I sat tonight, holding a secret worth $170 million. I looked across the table at my sister, whose name was written in sugar, and felt absolutely nothing but the cold, steady pulse of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. The reality of my daily life existed universes away from the polished dining room where my family now sat. While they navigated corporate politics and country club waitlists, my boots were perpetually caked in the toxic sludge of receding floodwaters or the gray, powdery ash of decimated neighborhoods. I was the lead operations coordinator for Hearthline Recovery Group, a private crisis management firm. Our mandate was brutal and unforgiving. We handled emergency housing deployment, immediate background verification, and temporary relocation for families who had lost absolutely everything to hurricanes, wildfires, and flash floods. People outside the disaster management sector fundamentally misunderstand what happens after a catastrophe. They see the news footage of helicopters dropping supply crates and assume the hardest part is the physical rescue. The truth is, the most devastating secondary disaster is the bureaucracy. Every single disaster season, I stood in the middle of chaotic municipal gymnasiums, transformed into evacuation centers, witnessing the exact same systemic failure. I saw exhausted parents sleeping in their freezing cars with their toddlers. Not because there was a lack of funding or a shortage of available motel rooms, but because the different entities involved were functionally incapable of talking to one another. The insurance adjusters operated on legacy software from the late 1990s. The federal emergency agencies relied on paper forms and overloaded servers. Local housing contractors tracked their availability on physical whiteboards. The hotel chains had their own proprietary booking systems. None of these databases communicated. As a result, a family might be approved for a 30-day housing voucher, but because the local building inspector could not instantly verify the structural ruin of their address to the insurance provider, that family remained homeless on the street. I realized very quickly that the catastrophe of displacement was not a problem of human empathy. It was a problem of fractured data. Everyone on the ground was working themselves to the bone, but because the data was completely siloed, thousands of desperate people were falling through the massive, invisible cracks in the system. I stopped feeling sorry for the victims and started dissecting the architecture of the failure. During grueling 16-hour shifts, surrounded by the hum of portable diesel generators and the cries of exhausted children, I began sketching out a solution on the backs of discarded intake clipboards. I envisioned a centralized, real-time coordination platform. I called the concept Shelter Bridge. The premise was aggressively practical. It would be a single, unified digital dashboard that pulled raw data from every disparate source. It would track available temporary housing inventory, synchronize required government documentation, monitor contractor inspection schedules, and map the real-time status of every single displaced household. If a motel room opened up in the next county, the system would instantly match it to a family whose insurance claim had just cleared the verification threshold, bypassing the human bottleneck entirely. I knew the logistics intimately, but I did not have the high-level coding architecture skills to build the back-end infrastructure from scratch. That was when I found Tess Mercer. Tess was a brilliant, fiercely pragmatic product engineer who had spent the last 8 years optimizing global supply chain software for massive freight corporations. She was burned out on making billionaires slightly richer by shaving fractions of a penny off shipping routes. We met at a terrible diner near the interstate. I slid my chaotic, coffee-stained wireframes across the sticky table. It took her exactly 45 minutes to see the sheer, unadulterated scale of what I was proposing. By the time the waitress brought our check, Tess had agreed to become my co-founder. What followed was a period of sustained, agonizing labor that would have broken a lesser person. I did not quit my day job. I could not afford to. Instead, I split my existence down the middle. From 6 in the morning until 8 at night, I was in the field, navigating disaster zones, arguing with federal representatives, and finding beds for traumatized families. At 8:30 in the evening, I would drive to Tess's cramped apartment. We would sit on her living room floor, surrounded by empty takeout containers, and build Shelter Bridge. I designed the user interface and mapped the complex logistical pathways based on my daily field observations. Tess translated those pathways into clean, aggressive code. We ran integration tests until our eyes blurred. I spent hours cold-calling regional hotel managers and independent contractors, begging them to let us beta test our software alongside their existing systems. Most nights, I did not make it back to my own bed. I would simply fold my arms on Tess's cheap kitchen table, rest my head, and sleep for 3 solid hours before my alarm dragged me back out to the evacuation centers. After 11 months of this grueling subterranean existence, we finally had a fully functional prototype. It was not pretty, but it was incredibly fast, and more importantly, it worked flawlessly. However, to move from a localized beta test to a system capable of handling a multi-county disaster response, we needed to migrate to enterprise-level servers and hire 2 dedicated full-stack developers. We needed capital. Not a fortune, just enough to bridge the gap until we could secure our first municipal contract. I swallowed my pride and drove to my parents' house on a Sunday afternoon. I brought my laptop, a meticulously researched 40-page business plan, and a projected revenue model. I did not ask my father for a handout. I did not ask him to empty his savings. I simply asked if he would be willing to co-sign a modest $50,000 commercial line of credit at our local bank, using his pristine credit score to back my venture. My father sat in his leather recliner, nursing a glass of expensive scotch. He did not even open the business plan I had placed on the coffee table. He looked at me with a mixture of amusement and deep, paternal condescension. He actually chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated with pure dismissal. "Ella," he said, shaking his head slowly, "you have a stable job with that relief agency. You are doing good, honest work. Do not try to be something you are not. The tech world is for sharks. It takes a certain kind of ruthless pedigree. Do not turn your perfectly adequate life into a tech gamble." He handed the unread business plan back to me. The rejection itself was a blow, but it was nothing compared to the absolute betrayal that followed exactly 4 days later. That Thursday, my mother invited me over for a family dinner. When I arrived, they popped a bottle of champagne. They announced, with radiant, overflowing joy, that they had just helped Sloan secure the down payment for a sprawling luxury condominium in the city's most expensive financial district. Sloan had complained that commuting from her current apartment was draining her energy before her corporate meetings. The down payment they had gifted her was over $150,000, 3 times the amount I had asked them to merely guarantee. My mother raised her champagne flute, her eyes shining with pride as she looked at my sister. Then, she glanced over at me, offering a polite, entirely unbothered smile. "We always believe in putting our resources exactly where the greatest potential lies," my mother declared to the room. "We only invest where the future is." She did not say those words to hurt me. She said them because she genuinely believed them to be an objective truth. She believed I had no future worth investing in. The sheer casual cruelty of that statement pierced through my chest, sinking deeper than any screaming match or physical blow ever could. It was not the denial of the bank loan that changed me. It was the chilling realization that to my own parents, I was a dead end. I did not argue. I did not throw my drink in her face. I quietly finished my dinner, washed the dishes, and drove back to my tiny apartment. I sat in the dark for 2 hours, letting the fury crystallize into something cold, hard, and utterly unbreakable. The next morning, Tess and I took out predatory personal loans with exorbitant interest rates. We maxed out 7 different credit cards. We hired the 2 developers. We bypassed the need for family approval entirely. They had refused to bet on me, assuming I would simply fold my hand and accept my place in the background. They failed to realize that by denying me their safety net, they had removed the very last thing tying me to their expectations. I was no longer trying to prove my worth to Martin and Denise Gray. I was going to conquer an entire industry, and I was going to do it completely without them. The sky did not simply break that late August. It shattered. A Category 4 hurricane tore through the southern coastline, dragging a terrifying storm surge and days of relentless, punishing rain across highly populated residential zones. The physical devastation was absolute, but the logistical collapse that followed was even worse. Within 48 hours, the regional displacement numbers skyrocketed past anything the state emergency management agencies had modeled for. Every viable motel within a 200-mile radius was booked solid. Demolition and repair contractors were paralyzed by the sheer volume of distressed properties. Thousands of federal relief applications choked the servers, bottlenecking the entire recovery effort. People were sleeping in high school gymnasiums on thin cots, staring at their phones, waiting for an approval email that the broken system was physically incapable of sending. This was the exact nightmare Tess and I had built our architecture to solve. We bypassed the federal red tape entirely and offered a closed beta test of Shelter Bridge directly to 3 of the hardest-hit coastal counties. The local directors were desperate enough to try anything that did not require a state-level mandate. We gave them the login credentials on a Tuesday morning. The impact was not gradual. It was immediate and violent. Before Shelter Bridge, the average turnaround time to match a displaced family with a verified temporary residence and an assigned contractor was anywhere from 4 to 9 days. By Wednesday afternoon, our platform had aggressively slashed that wait time to just under 4 hours. The magic was not in the user interface, though Tess had made it ruthlessly efficient. The magic was in the automated oversight. Within the first 24 hours of deployment, our code flagged 42 different independent contractors who were actively double-booking emergency repair orders, attempting to collect municipal deposits for jobs they could not possibly start for months. The software instantly rerouted those assignments to vetted, available crews. Furthermore, the system identified hundreds of ghost vacancies. These were motel rooms listed as occupied in the state database because someone had forgotten to uncheck a digital box when a family checked out. Shelter Bridge automatically pinged the front desks, verified the empty beds, and immediately texted the navigation coordinates to families freezing in civic centers. We even built an automated crawler that scanned stalled housing applications, instantly notifying caseworkers if a file was frozen simply because of a missing signature or an expired driver's license. We cleared a backlog of 2,000 stranded applications in a single weekend. Overnight, the narrative surrounding my career shifted. The municipal directors, the regional disaster coordinators, and the federal auditors, who had previously viewed me as just another exhausted dispatcher in a high-visibility vest, suddenly realized I was the only person in the room who fundamentally understood both the boots on the ground and the code in the cloud. My phone did not stop ringing. State representatives wanted emergency access. Insurance conglomerates were asking for integration timelines. But the call that changed everything came in late October. It was not from a desperate county official. It was from the acquisitions division of North Star Civic Systems. North Star was a monolithic titan in the government software sector, responsible for the digital infrastructure of dozens of major municipalities. They had the capital, the political lobbying power, and the nationwide contracts, but their existing emergency response module was an archaic, bloated disaster. They had been watching the data pouring out of our 3-county beta test. They did not just want to license our software, they wanted to swallow us whole. The due diligence process was a grueling marathon of corporate audits, code-based inspections, and relentless negotiations. Tess and I sat across mahogany tables from teams of corporate lawyers, defending every line of code and every strategic projection. It was during one of these endless review sessions, while sifting through a stack of acquired competitive market analyses provided by North Star's intelligence team, that a specific document caught my eye. It was a private venture capital advisory memo from an elite financial firm, commissioned by North Star 6 months prior to assess emerging threats in the civic technology sector. The author of the memo had dedicated a meager half-page to Shelter Bridge, dismissing it as an overly specific passion project. The analyst had written, verbatim, that the crisis management sector was a niche market, far too small and heavily regulated to ever become a massive financial entity. The signature at the bottom of that deeply flawed, arrogant assessment belonged to Graham Vale. My sister's fiercely ambitious, perpetually condescending boyfriend had looked directly at my life's work, evaluated its potential, and confidently declared it worthless. The irony was so rich, so deeply satisfying, that I actually laughed out loud in the quiet conference room. He had entirely missed the largest disruption his sector had seen in a decade, simply because he lacked the vision to look past his own polished ego. 2 weeks later, the paperwork was finalized. I sat in a high-rise legal office overlooking the city skyline and signed a legally binding acquisition agreement. North Star Civic Systems purchased Shelter Bridge for $170 million. The terms included a mandatory 5-year advisory role for me, ensuring the software maintained its operational integrity, alongside a substantial equity stake in the impending national rollout. When the wire transfer finally cleared, I was sitting alone in my cramped, drafty apartment. I logged into my banking portal, the screen loaded, and there it was. A number so large it felt abstract, completely divorced from reality. 9 digits sitting quietly against a sterile white background. I stared at the screen for a long time, waiting for the massive, transformative wave of emotion to hit me. I expected to feel like a completely different person, but I did not. I simply closed the laptop. I did not immediately call a real estate agent to buy a sprawling penthouse. I did not walk into a luxury dealership and point at a sports car. I did not even order a celebratory dinner. The next morning, I woke up at exactly 5:30, put on the same scuffed boots and the same worn-out olive-green canvas coat I had worn for the last 5 years, and drove to the regional logistics center. I kept my mouth completely shut. The silence was not born of humility. It was an act of profound self-preservation. If I walked into my parents' house and announced that the daughter they had systematically overlooked had just become a centimillionaire, they would not hear it as a victory. They would not suddenly recognize my intelligence, my resilience, or my worth as a human being. They would only hear the sound of a vault unlocking. They would instantly reclassify me from a useless piece of background furniture into an unlimited, highly exploitable resource. They would see an opportunity to fund Sloane's endless appetite for prestige, to cover my father's reckless investments, and to elevate their own social standing. They had refused to see me when I was struggling in the mud, building an empire with bleeding hands. I was absolutely not going to let them see me now, simply because I could afford to buy the building we were standing in. I was going to let them continue playing their parts, totally blind to the fact that the entire board had already been flipped. Exactly 7 days before we were scheduled to gather around the dining table, my phone rang. I was sitting in my newly leased, aggressively sterile corporate office, reviewing integration timelines for the national rollout. The caller identification flashed my mother's name. I answered, expecting perhaps a brief, obligatory inquiry about my well-being or a request to pick up ice. I was wrong. Denise did not bother with pleasantries. "Ella, listen to me carefully," she instructed, her voice tight with event planning anxiety. "Sloan and Graham are arriving right at 6 o'clock on Christmas Eve. Do not be late. We are creating a very specific atmosphere to celebrate her promotion, and I will not have you rushing in halfway through the appetizers and ruining the mood." She did not ask if I had to work. She did not ask how my year had been. She simply issued a directive to ensure her meticulously curated stage remained undisturbed. I assured her I would arrive precisely on time, hanging up the phone with a slow, calculating smile spreading across my face. That brief conversation cemented my strategy. I made a conscious, deliberate choice not to walk into Briar Glen looking like a woman who had just revolutionized an industry and secured a 9-figure buyout. I wanted them to treat me exactly as they always had. I needed the contrast to be stark, violent, and utterly undeniable. If I showed up in designer clothes or a luxury vehicle, they would adjust their behavior just enough to mask their usual disdain. I needed their unvarnished arrogance. So, I dressed in my standard armor. I pulled on a plain, dark gray knit sweater and faded black denim. I left my hair tied back in a simple, practical knot. I specifically chose not to wear the antique silver timepiece I had purchased for myself the week after the acquisition cleared. I drove my salt-stained SUV, the one with the rattling exhaust pipe, parking it right behind Graham's gleaming, leased German sedan. I was a ghost returning to haunt a house that did not believe in spirits. The living room was suffocatingly warm and loud when I finally stepped out of the kitchen. Martin was holding court near the fireplace, swirling his scotch and looking at Graham with the kind of deep, masculine affection he had never once directed toward me. They were discussing corporate strategy, or rather, my father was projecting his own unfulfilled business fantasies onto his future son-in-law. "It is all about that inherent drive," my father proclaimed, gesturing grandly with his glass. "You either have it or you do not. It is the gray bloodline. Frankly, ambition is baked right into our DNA. Just look at Sloan. She practically willed that executive vice president role into existence." I stood by the doorway, holding a tray of warm rolls, completely invisible. Martin spoke of ambition as a genetic trait that had miraculously skipped his firstborn, unaware that the true gray ambition had just dismantled a monolithic government bureaucracy while he was busy practicing his golf swing. Sloan was perched on the edge of the velvet sofa, holding a long-stemmed glass of Pinot Noir. She looked radiant, expensive, and entirely self-satisfied. She was detailing the layout of her new corner office and the imported quartz countertops she had selected for the condominium our parents had bought her. Her tone was a masterclass in passive aggression, a blend of forced intimacy and grating condescension. She caught my eye as I set the rolls on the side table. "So, Ella," she began, tilting her head with a look of practiced, shallow sympathy. "Are you still doing the whole boots on the ground thing? Running around handing out those little motel vouchers in the rain?" I looked back at her, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. "Something like that," I replied softly. Graham, sensing an opportunity to demonstrate his sweeping macroeconomic intellect, leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees. He offered me a patronizing, sympathetic smirk. "You know, Ella, you really should think about transitioning out of that sector. The civic tech and nonprofit logistics market just had a tiny temporary boom because of the recent storm cycles. It is a classic bubble." He took a slow sip of his drink, looking incredibly pleased with himself. "The smart players in that space," he continued, completely oblivious to the fact that he was lecturing the architect of the exact market disruption he was trying to summarize. Are the ones who know how to build a niche application and sell it early before the demand dries up and the bubble bursts. Anyone holding out for long-term municipal contracts is just going to drown when the federal funding shifts. It took every ounce of physical discipline I possessed to keep my face completely still. Graham was literally summarizing the exact exit strategy I had flawlessly executed 21 days prior. He thought he was explaining the rules of the ocean to a fish, unaware he was talking to the Leviathan. "That is a very interesting perspective, Graham," I said evenly. "I will certainly keep that in mind." My mother called us into the dining room before Graham could expand on his brilliant financial theories. We took our seats. As always, I was directed to the chair at the far end of the long mahogany table. Positioned directly next to the swinging kitchen door, it was the strategic seat, the servant's quadrant. From this position, I could easily stand up to retrieve extra gravy, fetch more napkins, or clear the salad plates without disrupting the flow of their conversation. As I sat down and placed my linen napkin across my lap, the sheer weight of the metaphor settled over me. They had literally physically positioned me at the exit. They had cast me in this role for 3.5 decades, the quiet, accommodating laborer who existed solely to facilitate their comfort. They did not want a daughter. They wanted an audience member who occasionally fetched the bread. I sat quietly while Martin poured the wine, and Sloane laughed at a joke Graham made. I did not feel angry anymore. The simmering rage that had fueled me through the cold nights of coding and the brutal negotiations had completely evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, freezing calm. I was not waiting for an opportunity to execute a cheap, impulsive revenge. I was not going to throw a tantrum or scream about my bank account like a petulant child demanding attention. I was waiting for the perfect, inescapable crescendo. I was waiting for the final, damning sentence from their lips, the ultimate proof that they still did not truly know who they were talking to. I needed them to build the scaffolding of their own humiliation so high that when I finally kicked out the support beam, the collapse would be absolute. The timer was ticking down, and I just needed to let them keep talking. I carried the heavy silver platter from the kitchen, the roasted beef emitting a thick, savory steam that briefly masked the artificial cinnamon scent of the house. I placed it perfectly in the center of the table, right between the imported wine and Sloane's gleaming white cake. I retrieved the warm rolls and the gravy boat, executing my duties with the silent, frictionless efficiency they had come to expect from me over the last 3 decades. Once the table was fully set, I retreated to my chair at the very end, the one closest to the swinging kitchen door, and quietly unfolded my napkin across my lap. My father, Martin, decided this was the exact moment to officially consecrate the evening. He picked up his silver knife and tapped it rhythmically against the rim of his crystal wine glass. The sharp, high-pitched ringing cut through the low hum of conversation, demanding absolute silence. He stood up slowly, straightening the collar of his tailored shirt, his chest expanding with a profound, almost aggressive sense of paternal pride. He raised his glass, pointing it directly at the opposite end of the table where my sister sat. "If I may have everyone's attention," my father began, his voice taking on the booming theatrical resonance he reserved for boardrooms and public speeches. "Tonight is not just about the holiday. Tonight is about recognizing exceptionalism. To Sloane, we always knew you possessed a rare greatness. You have not merely succeeded in your field. You have become the absolute pride of this household, and you have single-handedly taken the Gray family name to an entirely new level." Sloane practically glowed under the praise. She lowered her head in a display of practiced, false modesty, before raising her own glass to accept the tribute. Graham, seated beside her, wrapped a supportive arm around her chair and nodded with deep, solemn approval. My mother, Denise, pressed her hands together beneath her chin, her eyes shining with tears of sheer, unadulterated validation. It was a perfect, sealed ecosystem of mutual admiration. The toast concluded, glasses clinked, and the carving of the meat commenced. It was precisely in this atmosphere of unchallenged superiority that Sloane felt the sudden, inexplicable urge to punch downward. Her own massive success was apparently not satisfying enough unless it was directly contrasted against my perceived failure. She turned her head toward my shadowy corner of the table. The warm, radiant smile she had given our father morphed into something thin, sharp, and infinitely cruel. "So, what about you, Ella?" Sloane asked. Her tone was a masterful blend of feigned curiosity and potent condescension, designed to sound innocent to anyone who did not know the venom behind it. "Did that little temporary relocation app of yours finally manage to pull in enough profit to cover your gas money this month?" I did not freeze. I did not snap back with a defensive remark. I calmly finished chewing the small piece of bread in my mouth, swallowed, and reached for my crystal water goblet. I took a slow, measured sip, feeling the cold liquid slide down my throat, and set the glass back precisely in the center of its coaster. I picked up my silver fork, laid it parallel to my knife on the edge of my porcelain plate, and folded my hands neatly in my lap. I looked straight down the length of the table, meeting my sister's mocking gaze with eyes as flat and cold as concrete. "I sold the company," I stated quietly. The immediate response was a chorus of dismissive amusement. My father let out a loud, barking laugh, shaking his head as he sawed aggressively through a thick slice of beef. Sloane giggled, a bright, chiming sound, and shot a conspiratorial, weary look at our mother. Denise offered a tight, strained smile, the exact expression one uses to humor a delusional stranger on a subway train. "North Star Civic Systems acquired it," I added, my voice remaining perfectly level, cutting through their laughter without raising its volume. "We finalized the paperwork and executed the transfer exactly 3 weeks ago." The laughter around the table did not stop all at once. It died a sudden, violent death, and the catalyst for that death was Graham. The smug, self-satisfied smirk that had defined his face all evening vanished in a microsecond. His hand, holding a glass of expensive red wine, froze suspended in midair. As a venture capital analyst who monitored municipal infrastructure, he knew exactly what North Star Civic Systems was. They were a predatory titan. They were a corporate monolith that did not engage in small, trivial acquisitions to cover anyone's gas money. They executed massive, ruthless, industry-swallowing buyouts. Graham stared at me, his jaw slightly slack, his eyes widening as his brain frantically tried to reconcile the quiet woman sitting by the kitchen door with the corporate leviathan I had just named. Sloane, entirely oblivious to the sudden, rigid paralysis gripping her boyfriend, rolled her eyes. She leaned forward over her untouched plate, determined to ride the joke all the way to its bitter end. Her voice grew louder, openly mocking. "Oh, wow, good for you, Ella, truly. So, what did those giant corporate sharks give you for your little field project? How much was this massive buyout? 500,000? $1 million? I held her gaze. I did not blink. I did not inject a single drop of arrogance or triumph into my tone. I delivered the numbers with the clinical, devastating precision of a surgeon making a fatal incision. 170 million. The silence that violently slammed down onto the dining room was absolute. It was not merely a quiet moment. It was a physical vacuum. It felt as though all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the room, leaving nothing but cold, crushing pressure. My mother's face drained of color so fast she appeared physically ill, her skin shifting to a sickly, ashen white. The heavy silver fork in my father's right hand slipped from his suddenly numb fingers. It hit the edge of his fine china plate with a loud, sharp clatter, bouncing off the rim and tumbling onto the mahogany table, leaving a thick smear of dark brown gravy across the pristine wood. He did not flinch. He did not move to pick it up. He simply stared blankly ahead. Graham looked as if he had been physically struck. He was gazing at me with a profound, terrifying clarity, realizing he had just spent the evening lecturing and patronizing a founder who had successfully exited a 9-figure deal. He looked at me like a man who had just discovered he was standing on the tracks of an oncoming freight train. I knew exactly how their minds worked. Conditioned by decades of viewing me as a background character, Their brains would immediately begin scrambling for an alternative reality. They would try to convince themselves I was lying, exaggerating, or having some sort of mental breakdown. I refused to give them the runway to launch those doubts. I reached into the front pocket of my faded black denim jeans and pulled out my smartphone. I did not stand up. I did not wave the screen in their faces. I simply unlocked the device, opened my secure legal email client, and tapped on the final, countersigned acquisition contract bearing the unmistakable corporate letterhead of Northstar's legal division. Then, I smoothly swiped the screen over to my encrypted banking application, pulling up the unarguable, verified confirmation of the massive wire transfer that had cleared my accounts. I set the phone down and slid it slowly across the smooth wood of the table. It came to a stop exactly in the center, resting directly next to the base of Sloane's congratulatory cake. My father leaned forward with agonizing slowness, as if he were approaching a volatile explosive device. He squinted at the glowing digital screen. His lips moved slightly, silently counting the long string of zeros that stretched across the display. Graham leaned over my father's shoulder, his face turning even paler as he recognized the specific legal signatures on the Northstar documents. There was absolutely no ambiguity. There was zero room for debate or denial. The irrefutable, concrete proof of my victory was sitting right next to the mashed potatoes. Yet, the true source of the freezing temperature in the room was not the incomprehensible sum of money displayed on the glass screen. The money was just the hammer. The real devastation, the thing that truly shattered them, was the realization of their own catastrophic blindness. My mother finally managed to find her voice, though it was nothing more than a ragged, breathless whisper. "Ella," she gasped, her hands trembling as she clutched her napkin to her chest. "Why did you not tell us? Why on earth would you hide something this monumental from your own family?" I looked at her pale face, then shifted my gaze to my father's stunned expression, and finally to my sister, whose mouth was slightly open in a mask of pure shock. I let the brutal silence stretch out for a few more agonizing seconds, ensuring they felt the full weight of the moment, before I finally answered. "I did not hide anything from you," I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady, echoing through the dead air of the dining room. "I never kept it a secret. It is just that not a single person at this table has ever cared enough to listen to me finish a sentence." The absolute paralysis in the dining room lasted for exactly 4 agonizing minutes. I sat perfectly still, observing the raw, unfiltered psychological metamorphosis happening across the mahogany table. It was a terrifying and fascinating biological response to witness. I watched the initial, suffocating shock slowly metabolize into something far more familiar and dangerous. Their eyes darted from the glowing screen of my smartphone back to my plain, dark sweater. The tectonic plates of our family dynamic were violently shifting, moving away from a reality where I was utterly invisible and slamming directly into a new paradigm where I was suddenly a limitless, exploitable asset. They were no longer looking at a daughter. They were looking at a treasury. Graham was the first to break the dead air. He cleared his throat, the sound incredibly loud in the quiet house. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, his professional arrogance entirely punctured. Yet, as he spoke, it became abundantly clear that his profound embarrassment had absolutely nothing to do with how horribly he had treated me all evening. His shame was entirely rooted in his own professional failure. "I read that internal market advisory," Graham stammered, his voice tight, desperately trying to reframe himself as an industry peer rather than a fool. "The one about your platform." I completely misjudged the scalable architecture. I looked right at the localized deployment metrics and assumed the ceiling was too low for federal integration. I completely missed the upside. He was not apologizing for insulting my intelligence. He was agonizing over the fact that he had bet against a massive market winner. He looked at me with a desperate, hungry respect that made my stomach turn. Before I could even acknowledge Graham's pathetic attempt to salvage his professional dignity, my mother leaned forward. Denise had recovered from her near-fainting spell with remarkable speed. She pressed her linen napkin to the corner of her mouth, forcing a fragile, watery smile that did not quite reach her calculating eyes. "Well, Ella," Denise began, her tone adopting a sudden, unnatural softness that I had never heard directed at me before. "This is simply overwhelming. I mean, we are just trying to process this. But I imagine, with this incredible level of financial security, you must be thinking about the future. Your father and I have worked so hard for so many years. We are not getting any younger, and maintaining this household is becoming quite a strain. It would be such a blessing to have some of the burden lifted in our later years." She did not ask if I was exhausted from the years of relentless work. She did not ask how I had managed the extreme stress of a corporate acquisition. Within 5 minutes of learning about my success, she had already assigned a portion of my wealth to her own retirement plan. My father did not waste time with my mother's emotional manipulation. Martin preferred authority. He finally pulled his gaze away from my phone, straightened his spine, and reassumed his position as the patriarch. He wiped the spilled brown gravy from his fingers and cleared his throat, projecting a deep, commanding tone. "We need to be incredibly smart about this," Martin announced, leaning his forearms heavily on the table. The use of the word "we" was entirely deliberate. A financial windfall of this magnitude requires aggressive, structured management. I will call my wealth manager first thing on Monday morning. We need to sit down, just the two of us, and discuss a comprehensive family wealth strategy. You cannot leave capital like that unmanaged. Ella, I will oversee the portfolio diversification. It was breathtaking. He did not congratulate me. He simply assumed immediate, unearned jurisdiction over my assets. In his mind, my money was merely an extension of his own financial empire, a sudden influx of capital that rightfully belonged under his paternal control. Sloane, however, was not interested in portfolios or retirement plans. She sat rigid in her chair, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the stem of her wineglass. The realization that she was no longer the most successful, most important person in the room was visibly tearing her apart. She did not express an ounce of curiosity about the software I had built or the empire I had conquered. She was entirely consumed by the loss of her stage. "You did this on purpose," Sloane hissed, her voice trembling with pure, unadulterated rage. She slammed her glass down on the table, the dark red liquid sloshing over the rim and staining the white tablecloth. "You sat there all night, wearing that pathetic, cheap outfit, acting like a martyr, just waiting to humiliate me. This was supposed to be my celebration. You could have told us weeks ago, but you chose tonight just to steal my moment." I reached across the table, picked up my phone, and slid it smoothly back into my pocket. I pushed my chair back, the wood scraping sharply against the floorboards, and stood up. I did not raise my voice. I simply turned and walked out of the dining room, heading straight down the dimly lit hallway toward the front door. They scrambled out of their chairs and followed me, their voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus of demands, accusations, and frantic backpedaling. I stopped near the coat rack and turned around to face them. They halted a few feet away, a unified front of entitlement and outrage. "You are right, Sloane," I said, my voice cutting through their noise with the cold, heavy weight of absolute certainty. "I did choose tonight, because I needed you all to put on your perfect performance one last time. I needed to see exactly how you operate when you think I am nothing." I looked at my parents, feeling a lifetime of suppressed wounds rising to the surface, finally demanding sunlight. "You never needed me to fail," I stated, staring directly into my father's eyes. "My failure was never the goal. You just needed me to stay incredibly small, so that Sloane could always look bigger. You needed me to be the invisible, reliable background so you could pour every ounce of your resources into her without feeling guilty." Denise gasped, clutching her chest as if I had physically struck her. Her face flushed dark red with defensive anger. "That is a monstrous thing to say. Ella, that is completely unfair. We have always loved you both. We simply allocated things where they made the most sense. We gave things to the person who would appreciate them best, just like your grandmother Rose's silver bracelet." the moment the words left her mouth. Denise froze, realizing the catastrophic mistake she had just made. The air in the hallway turned to ice. Grandma Rose was my father's mother, the only person in this family who had ever showed me genuine, unconditional warmth. When she passed away, she left a specific, intricately carved silver bracelet to me. I had looked for it for months. Assuming it had been lost in the estate transfer, I had mourned that loss silently. I stared at my mother, feeling a sick, hollow dropping sensation in my stomach. "You gave Sloane the bracelet?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, terrifying whisper. Sloane shifted uncomfortably, suddenly looking anywhere but at me. My mother stammered, frantically trying to build a bridge over the chasm she had just blasted open. It was just that it matched her complexion so much better. "Ella, and you were always working in the mud. You never wore fine jewelry. We thought it was the practical choice." They had not merely neglected me. They had actively stolen from me. They had taken the one tangible piece of love I possessed and quietly handed it to my sister, completely bypassing my consent, because they firmly believed I did not require anything of value. It was the ultimate, undeniable confirmation of my absolute worthlessness in their eyes. I did not scream. I did not cry. The revelation did not break me. It liberated me. Every remaining shred of familial obligation, every lingering doubt, burned away in an instant, leaving behind nothing but cold, impenetrable steel. I turned away from them and reached for my heavy wool coat, hanging on the brass hook. I slid my arms into the sleeves, adjusting the collar around my neck. I reached out and grabbed the brass handle of the heavy front door. Pulling it open, the freezing, sharp winter wind rushed into the warm, cinnamon-scented foyer, biting at my skin. I stood on the threshold, 1 foot out in the freezing dark, and looked back at the 3 people who shared my blood, but knew absolutely nothing about my soul. "If any of you want to walk into my life from today forward," I said, delivering the words with the finality of a closing vault, "it will never be through the door to my bank account." The silence that followed Christmas Eve was absolute and heavy, stretching out over the first 3 weeks of January. Neither my mother, my father, nor my sister reached out. However, the void was quickly filled by the static of extended family. By the second week of the new year, my phone began ringing with calls from aunts, uncles, and distant cousins who had not spoken to me in a decade. Their tones were identical, carefully balanced between greedy curiosity and self-righteous judgment. They would ask how the weather was, casually pivot to my supposed newfound fortune, and then drop heavy-handed hints about how wealth can corrupt a person. It did not take a genius to realize that Martin and Denise had immediately mobilized to control the narrative. They were spinning a story to the entire Gray family tree that I had suddenly come into money, let it go straight to my head, and brutally abandoned my loving parents on a holiday. They painted me as the villain who had gotten rich and changed. It was easier for them to brand me a monster than to admit they had been negligent fools. I did not waste a single breath defending myself to my relatives. I simply blocked their numbers and funneled my energy entirely into the national integration of Shelterbridge. I was working 14-hour days, coordinating with federal emergency management directors, and migrating local municipalities onto the North Star servers. For the first time in my life, I also started seeing a therapist. Sitting in a quiet, sunlit office twice a week, I finally learned the correct vocabulary for my existence. I was not suffering from middle child syndrome or petty sibling jealousy. My therapist helped me identify the reality of my upbringing. Systematic emotional neglect. I had been raised as a utility, an appliance meant to function quietly in the corner without requiring maintenance. But the true depth of that neglect did not fully hit me until a freezing Tuesday morning in late February. I was sitting in the sleek, glass-walled conference room of my wealth management attorney, Camille Hurst. Camille was a brilliant, ruthless architect of financial structures, currently auditing my entire fiscal history to establish a series of blind trusts and philanthropic foundations. She slid a thin manila folder across the polished table. Inside was a stack of yellowing bank records. "Ella, I need you to look at these," Camille said, her voice completely devoid of its usual brisk professionalism. During the audit, my team pulled your historical banking data. We found a closed custodial investment account at Juniper State Bank. It was established under your Social Security number when you were a toddler, managed by your grandmother, Rose Gray. It matured when you turned 18. I stared at the document. I had never heard of this account. My grandmother had died a few months before my 18th birthday. There was slightly over $85,000 in the fund when it matured, Camille continued softly. It was legally yours, but you never signed for it. Your father, acting as the executor of Rose's estate, and your legal guardian at the time, executed a transfer of the entire balance. He drained the account 3 weeks after your birthday. I picked up the final sheet of paper. It was a scanned copy of the withdrawal authorization. At the bottom, next to my father's sweeping signature, was a handwritten justification note required by the bank for the transfer of a custodial asset. The ink was faded, but the words were crystal clear, written in my mother's neat, cursive handwriting. Ella does not require as much capital as Sloan, the note read. She is highly capable and can always take care of herself. These funds are being reallocated for immediate family business needs. I felt a cold, physical sickness wash over me. I remembered that specific summer vividly. I was working double shifts at the logistics center just to afford my used textbooks and my portion of the dorm fees. That was the exact same summer Sloan had decided she wanted to launch a boutique event planning business instead of doing a traditional internship. Her business had spectacular overhead, absolutely no clientele, and collapsed into a mountain of debt within 4 months. My parents had not simply let my sister fail. They had quietly stolen my inheritance, the financial safety net my grandmother had specifically built for me, to plug the massive hole of Sloan's first failure. They had forged a narrative that I was strong and independent, not because they believed in me, but because it provided them the moral cover to rob me blind. The $170 million revelation at Christmas suddenly felt entirely secondary. This was the true, bleeding heart of the betrayal. They did not just ignore me, they actively harvested my resources because they knew I was resilient enough to survive the theft. 2 days after this revelation, my cell phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number I had not blocked. It was Sloan. "Ella," she began, her voice strained, completely stripped of its usual arrogant lilt. She sounded panicked, speaking rapidly, as if she were hiding in a closet. "I know things ended badly at Christmas, but I really need to talk to you, privately. Mom and Dad do not know I am calling." I remained silent, letting her stew in the awkward dead air. "It is about Graham," she finally blurted out. "One of his major commercial real estate deals went completely sideways. It is a massive redevelopment project down on the coast, right in the middle of a storm recovery zone. The federal grants got tied up. The contractors walked, and he is dangerously over-leveraged. If he defaults next week, the firm will terminate him, and we will lose the down payment on our new condominium. Ella, I just need a short-term bridge loan, just $2 million, just for 90 days. We will pay you back with interest." The sheer breathtaking audacity of the request was almost poetic. She had spent my entire life looking down on me, had mocked my work just weeks prior, and was now secretly begging for a microscopic fraction of my wealth to save the very man who had called my company a temporary bubble. "No, Sloan," I replied, my voice as flat and unyielding as a sheet of iron. "Ella, please, you have so much. $2 million is nothing to you now." "It is not about the amount," I said calmly. "It is about the fact that you still view me as a resource to be harvested whenever you or your golden life hits a snag. I am not your safety net. I am not Graham's bank. You are going to have to figure this out the exact same way I figured out my entire life, completely on your own." I ended the call before she could scream or cry. I set the phone face down on my desk. Sloan's desperate plea for cash confirmed exactly how fragile the Gray family facade had become. They were bleeding money trying to maintain the illusion of elite success. My father's insistence on managing my portfolio was not just arrogance, It was an act of quiet desperation. I picked up my secure office line and dialed Camille Hurst. I did not want to throw a tantrum. I did not want to yell at my parents about Grandmother Rose's stolen money. Anger was a useless emotion against people who possessed absolutely no shame. I needed leverage, absolute, crushing leverage. "Camille," I said when she answered, "I need you to look into something else for me. Look at the title and the debt structure on my parents' property in Briar Glen. If I am right about their cash flow issues over the last decade, there is a very high probability they have leveraged that house to the breaking point." It took Camille less than 24 hours to confirm my suspicion. Martin and Denise had quietly taken out a massive second mortgage on the Briar Glen house through Juniper State Bank to cover Sloane's endless lifestyle upgrades and my father's failing investments. The terms of the loan were predatory, and they were currently 2 months behind on the payments. The bank was quietly preparing the preliminary paperwork for foreclosure. I did not pay off their debt. I did not send them a check. I executed a move that was entirely legal, brutally cold, and devastatingly precise. Through a newly formed anonymous holding corporation managed by Camille, I simply purchased the entire second mortgage directly from Juniper State Bank. I bought the paper. When the transaction cleared, I stood by the window of my office, looking down at the city traffic. I was no longer the invisible daughter waiting to be noticed. I was the primary lien holder on the house they slept in. If the moment for a final reckoning ever came, the bank would not be the one holding the stopwatch. I would be. The voicemail from my father arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. Martin Gray sounded entirely different from the booming patriarch who had toasted my sister on Christmas Eve. His voice was thin, carefully modulated to project a weary sort of wisdom. He requested a formal family reconciliation meeting. He spoke of mending fences and healing old wounds. I listened to the message while reviewing the latest server migration reports for Shelterbridge. Feeling nothing but a profound, clinical detachment, I knew exactly what this meeting actually was. It was not a sudden awakening of parental love. It was a desperate, emergency summit for a family whose financial house of cards was currently collapsing under the weight of an impending foreclosure. The hounds were finally at their door. I agreed to meet them on Friday afternoon, but I had absolutely no intention of walking into their designated arena without setting the stage myself. 3 days before the scheduled confrontation, I authorized Camille to release a comprehensive press statement to the regional business journals and the local Briar Glen Gazette. I officially launched the Rose Gray Housing Fellowship. I endowed the foundation with an initial capital injection of $5 million. Its mandate was twofold: providing rapid, unbureaucratic emergency housing grants for displaced families who fell through the cracks of federal aid, and offering full-ride academic scholarships for field coordinators in the disaster management sector. I named it after the only person in the Gray family who had ever looked at me and seen a human being rather than an appliance. The local media reaction was instantaneous and electric. Within 48 hours, the story was circulating through the manicured neighborhoods of my hometown. For decades, my parents had carefully cultivated an image of absolute superiority, throwing lavish parties to celebrate their own refined tastes and Sloane's superficial milestones. Now the community was suddenly scrutinizing them through a newly adjusted lens. The daughter they had actively minimized, the one they had treated like an embarrassing secret, was suddenly deploying massive wealth to build sustainable civic infrastructure. The contrast was brutal. My philanthropy laid bare the sheer emptiness of their vanity. When I arrived at the Briar Glen house that Friday, the air inside was thick with a toxic mixture of panic and resentment. We gathered in my father's wood-paneled study, a room designed to intimidate. Denise was already crying, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the heartbroken matriarch entirely overwhelmed by family discord. Martin sat behind his massive oak desk, refusing to make direct eye contact with me, shuffling papers as if he were preparing for a hostile corporate deposition. Sloane, however, was pacing the Persian rug like a caged animal. The local newspaper article about the fellowship had pushed her over the edge. She saw my charity not as a public good, but as a direct, calculated attack on her ego. You are weaponizing morality. Sloane snapped the moment I closed the heavy wooden door. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at me, her face flushed with indignation. Do you think we do not see exactly what you are doing? Naming a massive charity after Grandma Rose just to make yourself look like a saint while painting the rest of us as greedy monsters. You are using your money to punish this entire family. I did not sit down. I remained standing near the leather armchair, completely unaffected by her outburst. I did not mention the fact that I now owned the second mortgage on the very house we were standing in. The debt was a loaded gun, but I did not need to fire it yet. I needed to dismantle their illusions first. I am not punishing anyone, I replied, my voice cool and perfectly level. I am simply honoring the only woman who left me anything of value, which brings me to the actual reason I agreed to this meeting. I opened my leather briefcase and pulled out the single manila folder Camille had given me. I dropped it squarely in the center of Martin's pristine desk. The sound of the thick paper hitting the wood echoed sharply in the quiet room. I only have one question, I said, looking directly at my father. Who signed to take the money Grandma left for me? The reaction was instantaneous. Denise stopped crying mid-sob, the tissue freezing against her cheek. Martin's jaw locked. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking suddenly frail and incredibly old. Sloane stopped pacing. She looked at our parents, waiting for the righteous, indignant denial that usually followed any accusation against the Gray family honor, but the denial never came. The silence in the room stretched out, heavy, suffocating, and deeply incriminating. What account? Sloane asked, her voice dropping to a confused whisper. What is she talking about, Dad? Martin closed his eyes, his hands gripping the edge of the desk so tightly his knuckles turned white. He could not speak. The absolute silence was a confession more damning than any spoken word. I turned to my sister. For the first time in my life, I felt a fleeting, microscopic shred of pity for her. When I turned 18, I explained methodically, Grandma Rose left a custodial fund intended for my education and future. It contained over $85,000. It was drained exactly 3 weeks after my birthday to cover the massive debts you accumulated during your failed boutique event planning venture. They took my financial foundation and quietly fed it to your vanity project. Sloane physically stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the bookshelf. Her eyes darted from me to our father, the horrific realization washing over her, the impenetrable tower of her own ego, her lifelong belief in her inherent superiority, was crumbling in real time. She was finally understanding that her smooth, frictionless life had not been earned. It had been subsidized by the theft of my resources. Martin, tell her that is not true, Denise pleaded, her voice trembling with genuine terror. But she was not looking at me. She was looking at Sloane, desperate to preserve the illusion for her golden child. My father slowly opened his eyes. He looked at the folder on his desk, utterly defeated. It is true, he whispered, his voice cracking. Then, he took a shuddering breath, the weight of his own corruption finally breaking his posture. But that is not all of it, Denise gasped, turning sharply toward her husband. Even she did not know what was coming next. Martin looked up at me, his eyes hollow. A few years after the boutique failed, Sloane wanted to secure a commercial lease for another startup idea, a consulting firm. Her credit was completely ruined. Mine was heavily leveraged. You were in college, working 2 jobs, living completely off the grid financially. You had a pristine, untouched credit profile. He swallowed hard, the shame finally choking him. I used your clean credit profile. I bypassed your consent and legally guaranteed a $90,000 short-term commercial credit line in your name. I managed the payments secretly and resolved the account 2 years later before you ever had a reason to check your credit report. I told myself I was just borrowing your stability to save another one of Sloane's deals. The room spun into a sickening, absolute quiet. He had not just stolen my cash. He had stolen my identity. He had risked my entire financial future, exposing me to catastrophic debt, all to provide Sloane with yet another unearned opportunity to play at being successful. Denise buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Sloane sank into a chair, staring blankly at the floor, utterly paralyzed by the toxic reality of her own existence. I did not yell. I did not demand an apology. Apologies from these people were entirely worthless currency. I had the answers I needed. The autopsy of my childhood was officially complete. I reached out and placed my hand flat on the manila folder. I looked at the three of them, observing the ruins of the flawless, perfect American family they had pretended to be for 34 years. "You all think Christmas was the moment I embarrassed you," I said, my words slicing through the heavy, suffocated air with absolute, surgical precision. "No. Christmas was just the moment you ran out of the ability to hide it." The final confrontation took place exactly 2 weeks later inside the sterile, glass-walled conference room of Camille Hurst's downtown law firm. My parents had received a formal legal summons regarding the severely delinquent second mortgage on the Briar Glen property. They arrived looking physically exhausted, entirely stripped of their usual suburban arrogance and country club polish. They firmly believed Camille was acting as a proxy for Juniper State Bank, and that they were walking into a desperate, humiliating negotiation to beg a faceless financial institution for a foreclosure extension. Sloane was there as well, looking hollowed out and fragile, with Graham sitting a calculated 2 feet away from her at the edge of the table. The air inside the room was incredibly thick, heavy with the suffocating scent of impending ruin. Martin was the first to speak. He did not possess his booming patriarchal authority today. His voice was a defeated, ragged rasp. He looked across the polished mahogany table, not at Camille, but directly at me, and he finally confessed everything out loud. "I made choices," Martin began, his hands trembling slightly as he intertwined his fingers. Terrible, unforgivable choices. Every time Sloane stumbled, every time she failed or overreached, the threat to our family image was catastrophic. I panicked. "I consistently chose to rescue her manufactured success using your resources. Ella, I used your inheritance, I used your pristine credit profile, and I used your future." He took a shuddering breath, staring at the grain of the wood. "I did it because I had fully convinced myself that you were indestructible. I told myself that Ella would always be fine, no matter what I took from her. It was a convenient, cowardly lie that allowed me to sleep at night while I dismantled your foundation to build hers." Denise broke down next. The impeccable, emotionally distant matriarch shattered into a million jagged pieces. Her ugly truth spilled out across the room, raw and unedited. She wept openly, clutching a damp tissue, confessing the deepest rot of her maternal failure. "It was just easier," Denise sobbed, her voice echoing sharply against the glass walls. "Ella, you never demanded anything from us. You just handled everything on your own. It was so much easier to sacrifice the quiet, undemanding child than to face the terrifying reality that we were raising a spoiled, incompetent daughter who could not survive the real world. We fed you to her vanity because we were too weak to tell her no." Sloane did not cry. Her collapse was entirely internal, a silent, catastrophic implosion. She sat rigid in her expensive chair, her eyes wide and blank. She was not breaking because she was about to lose her luxury condominium or her social standing. She was shattering because, for the very first time in her life, she was being forced to look at the towering architecture of her own ego and realize that every single brick had been stolen from her older sister. Every accomplishment, every safety net, every arrogant boast she had made for the last 15 years was a direct result of my forced sacrifice. Beside her, Graham subtly shifted his chair backward. The movement was microscopic, but the implication was devastating. He did not reach out to hold her hand. He did not offer a word of comfort or defense. Graham was a man who only invested in shiny, profitable assets, and Sloane Gray was rapidly depreciating before his eyes. The prestige was gone, the financial backing was evaporating, and he was already mentally drafting his exit strategy, He was only there for the polished illusion, and the illusion was dead. Martin finished his pathetic, agonizing plea, turning his attention back to Camille. He asked the lawyer for just 6 more months to liquidate some minor retirement assets and restructure their debt. He braced himself for the bank's executioner's stroke, fully expecting me to sit there and gloat as a corporate entity swallowed his home. That would have been the perfect, cinematic revenge, but I did not gloat. I simply nodded to Camille. My lawyer smoothly slid a thick, heavy legal document across the table. It came to a stop right in front of my father. He looked down, his eyes scanning the bold print on the cover page. He frowned, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. The primary creditor listed on the lien was not Juniper State Bank. It was a private holding company. He read the name of the sole proprietor aloud, his voice barely a whisper. It was my name. The room went completely dead. The realization hit them with the force of a physical blow. I had bought the debt. I owned the paper. "I did not buy your mortgage to save this family," I said, my voice cutting through the silence with the cold, unyielding weight of absolute authority. "And I did not buy it to torture you with a drawn-out eviction. I bought it because I refused to let you play the victim. If I let the bank foreclose today, you would spend the rest of your lives telling your friends and relatives that a cruel, outside economic force ruined you. You would spin a tragedy. I am removing that option. You are not victims of the economy. You are going to have to look directly at yourselves." I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, dictating the new reality. "Here are the absolute conditions. The Briar Glen house will be listed for sale voluntarily within the next 14 days. You will downsize. From the proceeds of that sale, the exact sum of my grandmother's stolen fund, plus 15 years of compound market interest, will be wired directly into the Rose Gray Housing Fellowship. You will repay what you took, and it will go toward helping people who actually need it." I shifted my gaze to my sister, who flinched under my stare. "Furthermore, my parents will cease treating me as a financial lifeline. And you, Sloane, will finally carry the weight of your own existence. There are no more bailouts. There are no more stolen safety nets. You are entirely on your own from this second forward." They stared at me, paralyzed by the sheer, unarguable fairness of the trap I had built for them. It was a brutal path, but it was just. I had not destroyed them. I had simply forced them to pay their own debts. There were no tearful hugs. There was no beautiful, cinematic reconciliation where we all learned a valuable lesson and embraced. Some fractures are too deep, too foundational, to ever be repaired. I stood up, buttoned my heavy wool coat, and left the legal documents sitting on the table in front of them. I turned my back on my family and walked out of the conference room. I rode the elevator down to the lobby and pushed through the heavy revolving doors, stepping out into the freezing, sharp winter air. I took a deep breath, the cold wind stinging my lungs, and for the first time in my 34 years, I felt an overwhelming, incredible lightness. My life was finally my own, completely unwritten by the toxic favoritism of the people I was leaving behind. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are listening from, so please drop a comment below to share your thoughts and connect with me and others. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, leave a like, and hit that hype button so this video can reach and empower even more people.